The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Colin Magee. So for those that were expecting Sarah Mahar, I apologize. She had a disagreement with her horse last week, and the horse won. So she was unable to join us. She did give me some notes. I met the panel this morning at the coffee piece. So hopefully you'll give us a bit of flex on the flow on it. I'm not going to get into people's bios or to get into their particular topics. It is in the program. But I'm joined today by Karin Grimm, Human Security Officer in the Office of Secretary General for NATO, Dr. Marion Laurence out of Dalhousie University, and John Cockell out of Global Affairs Canada. So we've got a really interesting mix of backgrounds and practitioners in this domain. What I wanted to do was sort of set a bit of a preamble on it. We heard with the opening speakers that human security is a label. And given my background, former military, labels are fine, but you need to define it. You need to frame it, have that discussion as we move forward. The other piece that came out is our old ideas, can we use them and apply them to today? So that's part of the thing I think as we move through today and tomorrow is human security something new? Or is it simply rebranding of stuff that was done in the past and that we're already doing? I also want to bring it down and tighten it in a little bit. It's both my bias, I suppose, but it also is my opportunity as, I suppose, the moderator is when you look at the poster, the conference is about war, human security, and an evolving world. And so going back to labels and going back to sort of framing the discussion, what the thing we need to do is look at when we talk about war, what do we mean by that? And in today's context into the future, are we talking about war as some of the examples that were given out? Is it Ukraine, Russia? Is it China, Taiwan? Is it armed gangs in Haiti? Is it something else? Or is it all of that? And how does human security flex? Or how does the idea or the concept or the task related to human security evolve in that piece? Within these wide-ranging contexts, what does human security actually mean? And again, with my bias in it, what is the military role in that aspect? What we heard in the introduction pieces and what I've seen in a lot of the literature is human security is that broad, cross-departmental, whole of government, whole of organization approach. What does that mean to the military? What is the military's role in human security? So hopefully you'll keep those framing pieces in mind as the panel presents. We're going to go to each of the panelists, 10 to 15-minute presentation. I'll follow up with a couple of warming questions, and then we'll open it up to everybody else on it. So we'll start with Marion.
Thanks, Colin. Good morning, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. C'est un plaisir d'être ici avec vous. So I was asked to kind of set the stage for some of the more technical and practical discussion that's going to follow. Talking about trends in research related to human security and trying to distill some key findings from the scholarly literature that might be of interest and relevant for this audience. I'll be the first to admit that, academics don't always do a good job of translating their findings in a way that's, intelligible or even asking questions in the first place that a wide audience will find interesting. So I'm trying to kind of build a bit of a bridge here and explain why you should care about these things. So at a time of renewed interest in the concept of human security, and how it can make military operations more people-centric, make them more attuned to cross-cutting security challenges, I think it's worth asking two questions. So first, how can scholarly research actually improve our understanding of the opportunities and challenges that arise when trying to operationalize human security in multinational settings? And the focus of this panel is multinational contexts. And what useful takeaways does it actually offer for security sector actors who are working to integrate human security principles in their day-to-day work? So in keeping with Sarah's original suggestion that we aim for kind of an interactive chat approach, I'm not using slides, but if anybody wants to connect afterwards and there's something that piques your interest, I'm happy to provide more information. So human security has, since the 90s and before even, been a topic of interest to policymakers and to scholars. But if you look at most, peer-reviewed journals in international relations, global governance, foreign policy these days, there aren't that many people publishing things about human security explicitly, right? If we think about that label. And in fact, so back in 2020, I started a position at the Dallaire Center of Excellence for Peace and Security, chatting with people like Colin and others who said, we really need to think about human security and, its implications and so on. And I was like, human security, like from the 90s? Really? And I did a bit of a double take and I thought, didn't people stop writing about that in 2006? And but the more, and it certainly did, fall out in Canada at least, fell out of favor for a while. But the more we talked, I realized that this was in many ways a question of terminology, right? That people were still doing research on all sorts of topics and themes related to human security, and some of that was getting lost in translation. And even if they weren't using that particular term quite as much or quite the way they used to. So my goal today is to kind of highlight research in 3 areas that I think is relevant for conversations about human security. So the first is research on norm implementation in the field of international relations. Human security has such a strong normative dimension. I think it makes sense to think about how that kind of field of research can help us understand challenges and opportunities implementing human security. I want to talk about the politics and sociology of international organizations, that the concept of human security has largely been kind of developed and institutionalized through international organizations, whether it's the UN, whether it's NATO, whether it's beyond that, that the structure of those organizations and political dynamics within those organizations how they conduct their business is going to have an impact on how human security gets understood and applied. And the third thing I want to look at is research related to multinational or multilateral peace and stability operations. Looking at, related concepts like protection of civilians, POC. They're often at the core of those missions or, central to them. And there's research there that's useful. And again, I think why should a wider audience care about this stuff? Because I think it helps provide insights about practical challenges that are likely to arise. And it helps us identify opportunities for learning and innovation related to human security. So on the first point here about norm implementation, human security is can arguably be understood as sort of a cluster of normative claims and normative commitments about how security should be defined. So you have kind of the old conversations about freedom from fear, freedom from want, and whose security matters, right? The security of individuals and communities as opposed to just a more traditional state-centric definition. Couple of key takeaways, and these will kind of link back to comments that were made earlier. So concepts like human security tend to be products of, a particular time and place, a particular historical context, right? I think it's no coincidence that, human security had its peak, had its heyday in the mid-90s, immediately following the end of the Cold War, a period that some people were calling the end of history, the triumph of liberalism, that human security with its focus on the rights and, well-being of individuals fits into that sort of global zeitgeist. But if that context changes, as it seems to be changing, that has implications for these types of concepts. And I think that's probably a theme that we'll return to. The second point is that norms and normative commitments and concepts like human security, they're kind of overarching and cross-cutting, that they never exist in isolation, that they complement or compete with or reinforce other norms. A former colleague who was an international lawyer, this is David, Colin will remember, was always saying, human security in many ways is just sort of repackaging and extending legal commitments that already exist within international humanitarian law, international human rights law. Another point too, more recently you've seen debate about what is the relationship between human security and the women, peace and security agenda, right? So again, there's conversations there about how these things are connected. And the third point, that these concepts are malleable and they're contested. And this is something, Roland was writing about 20 years ago, right? That the concept of human security is big and sometimes vague and sometimes ambiguous and sometimes that's deliberate, that it can be understood in different ways and that it might be difficult for certain actors to kind of pick and choose and prioritize different parts of that concept. So the second area I want to talk about is international organizations, some key takeaways there. So that, again, whether it's the UN, whether it's NATO, whether it's others, in many ways they're constrained by what member states will allow them to say, what they'll allow them to do. And given what I just said about the malleability of a concept like human security, there are some very real ways in which human security means whatever states decide it will mean in terms of implementation. And if they can't agree, again, if you have a table where there are many conflicting interests, the term can be left deliberately vague, right? Or maybe you end up with a very bare bones definition because that's what's politically possible, right? And that has implications for those who then have to go implement it. The second point I wanted to make is that, the politics don't stop with member states, right? That international organizations, like any other large organization, they're beset by some of the same bureaucratic rivalries, right? That would affect other international or other organizations. Time and resources are limited. Different departments and divisions may be kind of competing with each other, even if they are kind of in theory working under kind of one human security umbrella. That you can have, political differences within those organizations that affect efforts to implement human security. And last, international organizations are prone to inertia. They're large ships and it takes time for them to change direction. So that even if there's kind of political pressure from the top, pushing for human security to mean one thing or look a particular way, that the process of bringing that change about can be very slow. How am I doing for time? Good? Okay. I'll finish up here. The last section. And then I had a couple of questions to share too. So in terms of research on multinational peace and stability operations, what is there coming out of that's useful here for this audience? One of the most important things, and there's a lot of work, for example, on thematic priorities like protection of civilians and how POC mandates get implemented. And I know that's something John will talk about. The research tells us to expect variation in how different actors and institutions understand those mandates, that those mandates, they're always products of political compromise. And again, the more players you have sitting at the table involved in drafting them, and the more diverse their interests and the more diverse their normative commitments, the more compromises you end up with. And again, like the concept of human security itself, the solution sometimes is a vague or ambiguous mandate, which leaves a lot of room for interpretation at the field level. What that means also in practice when it comes to implementation is that you'll see a lot of variation in how different individuals, how different contingents kind of interpret a mandate. And some of that is a product of training, different national doctrine, different professional backgrounds, past experience. Those are all things where a mandate sort of gets filtered through a person's previous experience and understanding of what something like human security should mean. And that variation, it can be a problem. It can be a source of inconsistency. But I just want to note that sometimes it can also be a source of flexibility, right? Potentially a source of innovation, potentially a source of change for the better. Looking ahead, I'll just wrap here. I see a few questions that are worth thinking about going forward. There's been some conversation already about geopolitical tensions, strategic competition, and how those might affect efforts to operationalize human security. And I want to go back to this point I made at the start, the idea that human security, to the extent that it focuses on, the rights of individuals, individual freedom, has its roots in kind of liberal theory in some ways. And there's a lot of conversation about challenges to the liberal world order. So we need to think about where human security fits within that. NATO, for example, in particular, is very explicit, linking human security to the alliance's focus on individual liberty, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. But we also know there's a lot of literature on sort of non-Western approaches to human security, right, that might look different. So we need to think about where the concept goes in that context. I think we also need to think about whether are all tasks and all mandates compatible with a human security approach. I think that's a bit of for me anyway, an elephant in the room question, that you may have situations where certain tasks or objectives, especially related to state building, extension of state authority, can potentially be in tension with human security goals and objectives, which really just takes us all back to the original debate about the relationship between human security and state security, right? To what extent are states or particular states, reliable guarantors of human security, and to what extent are they part of the problem? I think I'm going to leave it there. Thanks.
Great. No, thank you, Marion. That's a really good initial framing with some good thoughts and questions to follow up with. I'll turn over to John, who will give us a perspective from the UN side of the house. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to take part in this cases conference for this year. I apologize for my voice. I hope it'll last for the duration of my short presentation. I'm getting over bronchitis from like 10 days ago, so it's still with me. So I've been back at Global Affairs Canada for about a year, but before that I was with the UN system for about 15 years, mainly in Africa, different peace operations, spent 3 years in Mali with MINUSMA before coming back to Ottawa. So my remarks are going to draw a little bit on that experience from the field, but I thought before I get into that, I'll just throw out a few ideas on human security, also in complementarity with points that were made earlier by Marion and by Roland also. And I might even touch on that period in the 90s when Canada's foreign policy was much more about human security than it was from 2015-16 on. And I had a chance to work on that when I was a young officer in the department back when I started out my career. But anyway, so let me just, and I don't mean to go over all of the global challenges on human security. I mean, Roland did a good job of that in his opening remarks, but let me call out three things in particular that I think are relevant when we're talking about how to make sense of human security in a more practical way, and including in peace and stability operations in the field. The first is that these kind of protracted internal conflict dynamics that many of these missions are faced with are driven by structural grievances over identity, over political participation, over economic inequality, social cohesion, vulnerability. And this problem set, it's not new to us. We've been facing this for the last 2-3 decades. But the problem now, and Roland touched on it in his opening remarks, is that we have a decreased normative consensus internationally on core principles of global peace and security, on governance, on human rights, and even in international humanitarian law. And then in that same context now, and this has been a particular problem certainly in Mali and in Eastern Congo and other operational environments where we deploy stabilization and peace operations, is that you have weak or absent state control in peripheries, aggravated by a rejection of the legitimacy of state authority and or competing centers of effective control, insurgencies, violent extremism, opposition against state power. And this problem set, as I say, it's not new, but I think human security actually still offers interesting ways to think about how we can respond to that set of challenges. And when the UN first elaborated the concept of human security in 1994, it later set up a human security unit in the Secretariat in New York. For me, at that time, as I say, when I was starting out in the Foreign Service, the advantage of human security was that, and the way that the UN was talking about it, is that it talked about human security in a way that addressed not only the situation of the individual or how to understand individual security, but it also included community security or group security as against the security of the state. And I thought that was very important when thinking about problems of internal conflict and the way that different groups within divided societies respond to the legitimacy of state power, the perceived illegitimacy of state power. And I still think that that's true today, and I'll come back to it in just a few moments. So this graphic will be familiar to all of you. This is the one that the UN uses nowadays to talk about the three dimensions of human security. So freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom to live in dignity, which is sort of the more recent way of thinking about human security. Is basically a kind of rights-based understanding of human security. It's rooted in international humanitarian law and human rights law. But when Canada was first starting out with the foreign policy on human security, we really focused more on the freedom from fear part of it, a little bit on freedom from want as well. So if you look at that policy statement that came out in 1999, if anyone wants to look at this, I have some cotton gloves up here that you can use to look at this document from the archives. But really the focus was more on the freedom from fear, and particularly, safety for people from violent threats, basically was the approach. But since then, and the way that the UN goes at it now, it's much broader. It includes in particular this kind of rights-based, what I would think of as a rights-based approach to human security and protection. And more interesting for me, because I had to do a little bit of spade work before coming to the conference on what's been happening on human security in the last few years, because I must admit I hadn't paid very much attention to it when I was off in Africa and operations and so on. So I was very curious to see that now in the new strategic concept for NATO, you have this prominent reference to human security, and in particular noting that it includes the protection of civilians and civilian harm mitigation, and that this is central to the approach of NATO to crisis prevention, which is one of the key parts of the NATO mandate, of course. And it goes on to note, and I highlighted it there, that protection of civilians from conflict-related physical violence or threats of physical violence by other actors. So it's really, again, linking the protection of civilians to protection from physical violence. So very useful, very interesting. But what does this mean actually in practical terms? Well, if we go back to that graphic that I pulled from the UN's Human Security Handbook, to me, what this means is that this blue section of the triangle is kind of what you get with this emphasis on physical protection from violent threats. So a focus on a more, let's say, rights-based understanding of protection. And the issue with this, and I mentioned earlier that we're in this period now where there's more geopolitical contestation around the normative foundations for things like international humanitarian law. But if you take a rights-based protection understanding of human security, then you have, it seems to me, an imperative to save lives. This is the humanitarian understanding of protection, and that imperative is supersedes others, including in operations and things like peace and stability operations and so on. This becomes problematic, and I'll get into that in just a moment, based on my experience in Mali. But I just want to note that some of this kind of conceptual approach may be useful when we're thinking about how to understand how human security operates in the world that we live in now, including where we have this greater contestation over the normative foundation, let's say, of some aspects of human security, including protection. So let me just turn quickly to some of the things that I observed when I was working in Africa with the UN in complex peace operations, and touch in particular on the problem of protection of civilians, which is as I mentioned a moment ago, has been called out in particular as a foundation for NATO's understanding of how to incorporate human security into its strategic concept. Well, so like NATO, the UN at this point now actually has quite a lot of doctrine on protection of civilians in peace operations. And in particular, the UN talks about there being three tiers or three aspects of protection of civilians. You have the physical protection part, which I talked about a moment ago. You also have protection through the political process. And the establishment of a protective environment. So I don't want to get into all of those three things, but just to note that there are these three elements. But since about 2015 or so, in UN operational practice, and you can even see it in the way that the mandate language comes from the Security Council when it talks about protection of civilians, that the emphasis is really very much on the physical protection part of the protection from protecting people from the physical threat of violence. And it's become the dominant way that in practice protection of civilians is understood within the UN, both in policy terms, but particularly in operations on the ground. But the problem is that you have large, complex missions in large countries like Mali, South Sudan, Congo, even Somalia, Central African Republic. And in these environments, these large AORs, you have forces that are very thinly spread out over a very large area, and they're focused really largely on protecting bases, convoys, main supply routes. And at the same time, and this will be very familiar to all of you here, all of these missions continue to suffer from a lack of key enablers. So not enough mobile task force kind of contingents, not enough QRF kind of support quick reaction forces, certainly not enough helicopters. You need all of these things in order to make a more mobile approach to protection of civilians actually work in these kinds of environments. So the operational capacity is very, very limited in these missions. And even a big mission like MINUSMA, which had about 15,000 uniformed personnel, another couple of thousand civilians, putting protection of civilians as a priority in the mandate, and it was one of the priorities in the MINUSMA mandate, pulls resources away from the main effort of the mission. And ultimately, even though it does that, it still fails, still operationally fails routinely. So, for example, this is a graphic depiction of the maneuverability of the MINUSMA force in August of 2022. Now, the blue circles indicate the range that the MINUSMA force was able to patrol away from our main bases in places like Agulha, Kidal, Timbuktu, and so on. This is all to scale, by the way, and this isn't even showing the full map of Mali. If I showed this on the full map of Mali, you wouldn't even be able to see where the MINUSMA force was maneuvering. So blue circles are the patrol areas. Blue lines are the main supply routes, right? And then we have that op box down in the lower right-hand corner that I might return to in questions and so on. So anyway, you can see that it's very limited, the coverage, let's say. Now, achieving this level of coverage in maneuverability for the MINUSMA force took 92% of the capacity of the mission. 5 minutes. Okay, thank you very much. So 92%, just based on protection of the force and the mission's activities. Okay, that leaves 8% for everything else, including protection of civilians. And so I say that's in August of 2022, but that was throughout the life of the mission when I was there. It was always the case that 90% of the mission's force capacity was dedicated to protection of the mission itself. 8%, 10% left for everything else. So, including, support to implementation of the peace agreement, support for rule of law, human rights investigations, everything else under the mandate. So 8% is left. And then the problem is when you overlay on top of that, these were the protection of civilians hotspots over the 3 months preceding that snapshot of maneuverability. And you can see that the intensity of incidents, POC incidents, outside of the mission's geographic reach was very considerable. And the result was that MINUSMA was not able to respond to the scope and the scale of threats to protection of civilians. And as the Force HQ told the senior management group when they were presenting these slides to us at the time, they said, and the Force commander said very clearly, we are failing in our mission. And the government of Mali's expectations were, well, first, that they wanted MINUSMA to help out with counterterrorism. We couldn't do that under the mandate. So their attitude was, well, if you can't help us fight the terrorists, can you at least protect the areas where the terrorists are attacking them? Well, we couldn't. And that's an indication of why, let's say a graphic indication of why we can't. So the key point here is that chronic failure on protection of civilians in peace operations risks long-term damage to multinational or UN peace operations credibility, while core conflict or crisis management needs are deprioritized in the same context. I think this is problematic for how we think about how to operationalize human security in practice. And then, as you can see, I mean, just to reiterate the point about how we were failing. So this is over the 5 years of when we had, let's say, peak MINUSMA, or peak operational capacity under the mandated strength of the mission. So the green bars are the impact on civilians of violence. And as you can see, pretty much a steady increase all over that whole period of time. I think I'm going to skip that. So over those same 5 years, I said, where we had peak MINUSMA, let's say approximately from 2017 to 2021 or so, violent insurgency was spreading throughout Mali. And it was driven in part by intercommunal differences or anti-state grievances by different minority groups within Mali over political exclusion, economic inequality, breakdown of interethnic social cohesion, and ethnic versus Islamist identity factors. So again, any of you who've worked on Mali, this is all very familiar. And my contention is that as the mission did too little to refocus priorities on conflict management, because too much of that little capacity within the mission was being drawn towards protection of civilians emphasis, it needed to pivot to address these core conflict management problems in central Mali and in eastern Mali. And as it was unable to do that operationally, insurgency spread, and effectively you're not achieving the human security objectives of the mission if your operational priorities are being confused in this way. So where does this take us when it comes to where NATO is going with human security? So one thing that I actually found, which I quite like, in terms of what NATO's been saying about human security lately, is that in its military concept on protection of civilians from 2018, it actually makes a very key point for multinational or UN peace operations, which is the importance of prioritizing a safe and secure environment for the delivery of support to government institutions, including local government, for peripheral or minority group areas like central or northeast Mali, eastern Congo, these kinds of areas that I just described where you have contestation over the legitimacy of state authority. So in these kinds of environments, and MINUSMA was certainly one of them, you need to have more force prioritization of establishment of area security, a safe and secure environment for the delivery of mediation, human rights investigations, for préfets and local governmental authorities and judges and police to be able to return to those areas so that they can start engaging with the local population, or indeed for those minority areas to establish their own forms of governmental authority that are more acceptable to them. So when we were talking a little bit earlier in the morning about the importance of the local communities in human security, not just sort of a state-down, top-down approach, this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. But you need, in these kind of multinational operations, to be able to have a safe and secure environment for this kind of programming to work. So what in all of this? So 2 points to close on the so what. So a moment ago, Marion talked about in the UN context, in some mandates or in a number of mandates and stabilization missions, you have this reference to restoration and extension of state authority. This is where the UN as an organization needs to have greater operational effectiveness in how it goes about this. And in particular, what it needs is joint military, civilian, and police capacities to implement restoration of state authority or extension of state authority mandates in practice. But this is a very much a neglected priority, I have to say, compared to POC. If you look at the amount of doctrine and the amount of guidance and frankly, the amount of pressure that UN headquarters puts on missions to implement POC, it's staggering when you compare that with how little there is on restoration and extension of state authority. I mean, it's a tremendous imbalance. And as a result, missions, as I say, they are under pressure to establish temporary operating bases in certain areas, for example, to improve POC in that area. But as soon as you've taken away, let's say 5% of that available 10%, then you don't have that anymore to establish a TOB in an area where you would need to support the extension of state authority or even the creation of state authority in certain areas where it's never existed. So I think that you have to have that kind of joint military, civilian, police approach, certainly better doctrine, better guidance from headquarters and from member states on how to go about this, but planned and executed in coordination and in alignment with national and local capacities for governance, basic service delivery, and security. And in human security terms, this would address the need for sustainable effects in both the freedom from fear and the freedom from want parts of the triangle that I started off with. So I'll conclude by saying what I'm advocating for here in calling for better approach to extension of state authority and better attentiveness to local government and basic service delivery in these kinds of environments, that you shift away from a rights-based understanding of protection of civilians, which, as I say, it forces us into this position where we're somehow obliged or required to save lives above everything else, and shift the balance so that there's more attention to working with local communities on establishing legitimate governance and basic service delivery in a way that makes sense to them and is more sustainable over the longer term. So thank you very much, and I hope I haven't run too far over time.
Well, thank you for that. Quite interesting, the shift on the focus is a good conceptual framework to carry on to the discussion piece in a couple of minutes. So our last presenter is going to give us a view of human security from the NATO lens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin, and thanks also to the organizers for the invitation. It's really a great pleasure to be here and to be part of this conversation. Please also note that I'm an advisor indeed to the NATO's SRSG, covering WPS and human security, but I'm not a NATO staff officer, so the views expressed are my own and might not reflect the ones of the organization. Now, I guess it's also a bit, the beauty and the difficulty of being the last speaker. I think many things have already been said. And also thanks so much, John, for really diving into the very concrete protection of civilians in Mali. That was really very interesting. So I'm going to look at it now a little bit from a different angle, more from an HQ perspective when it comes to human security at NATO. And I think indeed, as we look at today's security environment and ongoing armed conflicts in various theaters, we must recognize that security challenges occur and must be also addressed in spaces inseparable from civilian populations. I had the same statistics as the previous Roland was actually using in terms of, from civilians being deliberately targeted as a method of warfare, safety and security of civilians being leveraged to serve military objectives, to also urban warfare, to emerging disruptive technologies, and not to repeat all the other multiple challenges that have been raised previously. So today's international security environment is indeed complex and also evolving. Now, NATO has reacted to this changing security environment and the interconnectedness of global issues with NATO's current strategic concept that was already mentioned by John, endorsed by NATO leaders at the Madrid summit in 2022. And this strategic concept is really crucial because it also positions several issues, including human security, women, peace and security, and climate change as of cross-cutting importance, meaning they need to be integrated and need to be considered in all the alliance does. Now, at the same occasion, NATO's human security approach and guiding principles were also endorsed, and the commitment to the human security agenda was actually reiterated at the two following summits. But overall, there's a bit more than maybe 2 years that have passed since, which seems like a lot, but yet I think it's actually very little time for institutional implementation. Inertia was previously mentioned as well. So let me just briefly remind us of some of the key elements of the human security agenda at NATO, because we do have different understandings and definitions of what is human security. Just as a reminder, while NATO's human security approach and guiding principles draws upon the UN approach to human security, but as a political military organization, NATO has adapted the scope of its human security agendas to its mandate, indeed focusing more on security threats. Currently, the agenda encompasses 5 areas of work, namely POC, children and armed conflict, conflict-related sexual violence, combating trafficking in human beings, and cultural property protection. Furthermore, also, and I think it might have been mentioned before, with regards to the WPS agenda at NATO, the two agendas are considered to be complementary and reinforce one another while being two separate and standalone agendas. I'm also just mentioning that because some countries have different approaches to it and have chosen, for example, to integrate WPS under their human security agenda. As per NATO's human security approach, the objective is to prevent and respond to risks and threats to all people, especially in conflict or crisis situations, through embedding considerations for the comprehensive safety and security of the populations into all stages and levels of alliance operations, missions, and activities wherever NATO operates. So this is the framework really in a nutshell. Sorry if I'm going a little bit fast, but I think many of you are probably also very much familiar with it. But for the sake of time, let me just raise three main considerations and maybe or pressing challenges maybe that I see at this point in time as NATO is implementing this agenda. Now, the first one concerns the evolving geopolitical environment and shifted focus on NATO's core task of deterrence and defense. We just heard about, even in the strategic concept, how still POC, for example, was very much framed under the crisis prevention and management task. But we really need to look at what does this change focus mean for NATO's human security agenda and its 5 areas of work, as really they were mainly developed and operationalized in the context of out-of-area crisis management, such as in the Western Balkans and Afghanistan. So while the 2022 strategic concept has clearly stated that human security is to be integrated across all the 3 core tasks, I think there is still a certain mindset or maybe sometimes a tone of crisis prevention and management, as this is really where it has been operationalized. But looking, for example, at Russia's war against Ukraine, I think the relevance of human security agenda in a defense situation on one's own territory becomes really obvious. And there are certainly also lessons that can be learned from Ukraine and that need to be looked at. So as NATO is sort of undergoing this transformation in terms of posture, focusing on its first core task, also human security agenda needs to be fit for purpose and be able to respond to the current needs of the alliance. Also given that there is a certain inconsistency and incoherency in terms of the various policy areas as they have all been developed at different times, at different point in time. So this work is ongoing from the political and strategic level, for example, in terms of policy work, as we look actually into also updating the protection of civilian policy, to also the tactical level. Just last week, NATO's Allied Rapid Reaction Corps, ARRC, hosted a conference focusing on the military contribution to human security and civil-military cooperation at the tactical level for operations within Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. So looking at questions such as coordination with host nation or developing understanding of the civil environment to address human security risk in collective defense and contemporary warfighting. The second consideration I would like to raise here relates to the trends and challenges affecting today's and tomorrow's security environment, such as climate change or more generally environmental security, the emerging disruptive technologies such as autonomy, disinformation, but also increased urbanization and therefore urban warfare, just to name a few. I think these trends and challenges are affecting the strategic environment, security environment. They also alter the character of conflict and also affect the way armed forces and NATO operates. I think we have already touched on that a little bit as well. Now, how do they connect with NATO's human security agenda? What are the implications from a human security perspective when there is large-scale combat in densely populated urban areas in which civilian and military areas are often found in close proximity and increasingly intertwined? Or what are the implications for the protection of civilians of the use of military artificial intelligence capabilities during armed conflict? So going back again to the 2022 strategic concept, there is work that needs to be done and that needs to be continued in terms of human security cross-cutting importance to other topics NATO is looking at. And I think that's also directly sort of a hint or a ball that I'm passing also to probably where academia can do to work. I think there's always a challenge that for many of these topics, there is a lot out there, but very often it doesn't necessarily correspond, for example, to how NATO looks at it. So then it becomes very different when you have human security, but then you have many other topics, integrated in that human security concept when actually NATO is looking at those 5 areas. So definitely there is some more work to be done. And I think also there are upcoming panels that will look actually in some of these topics. So that will be very interesting. Now, my third and last consideration, and probably also the most central one, is operationalization. So how do we translate the political commitment into the field? How do we operationalize the human security agenda across NATO enterprise, including also the force structure? And as mentioned, it's only a bit more than 2 years that have passed since the strategic concept and human security approach and guiding principles were endorsed, putting these 5 areas of work under the human security umbrella. But also, let me be clear, obviously the operationalization is not starting from scratch. So these topics have been there for a long time and have been quite developed, but not under this angle. So there is something that our unit is focusing on in the Office of the Secretary General is that we what we call bringing alignment and coherence into the human security agenda, which I think actually ultimately also is linked to capability development and interoperability. So under this last consideration, let me just briefly touch upon 3 aspects if I have time for that. Yeah. So the first one is really, fostering a shared understanding. I think that is still something that needs to be done. It's a multinational organization, so there are many concepts around. There are many member states, etc. It's a new concept. Different definitions are around. So I think there is still very much a need to involve to further promote the understanding of the human security agenda, building also on the human security approach and guiding principles, and sort of further promote consistency across the human security areas of work. So, how do we exactly understand, for example, the guiding principles? For example, prevention and protection oriented. What does it mean concretely? So I think there is really still a lot of work that needs to be done to better, as I said, make it more consistent, coherent, but really also to understand what is exactly meant. The second aspect is structure and resources. So for an effective implementation, an institutional structure with clear roles and responsibilities and appropriate resources is needed. And here is again the question, where does it sit? I don't know where Canada currently is maybe leading that conversation, where currently human security is situated. Is it in, at NATO, it's mostly probably J9, or where would it be? And here is the question, should a similar approach as, for example, for the WPS agenda be taken, where we have GENAD and the gender focal point structure, and we have mainstreaming across joint staffs, or what can also be maybe learned from that experience, should there be, is there a need for a more developed professional career structure, like for POLAD or LEGATS? How do we make sure, in the end, I think that is what is important, how do we make sure that there is qualified personnel available within the military to actually implement that agenda? And that is currently being assessed. So I don't have any answer of what it will look like. So this is really an ongoing process. The last aspect is also the change in mindsets, I would say, and the change in organizational culture in terms of the way and probably that would be sort of maybe similar or a point that maybe also John just mentioned, but it would really be how human security is looked at and understood as a military priority or as a military end in itself. For example, when civilians and civilian infrastructure are deliberately targeted in a defense scenario, their protection might need to be prioritized over, for example, defeating the enemy. So there are many questions, I think, that might really require sort of a change in mindsets, but also in terms of probably the ways of working, where it comes to maybe taking more collaborative approaches rather than working in silos, or the way analysis are being done, how information is collected and interpreted, whether it's more in favor of a human security agenda or it's interpreted in a different way. So I think there are many questions when you have a prevention and protection oriented approach. So I think I stop here with these considerations. There could be many more, and I'm sure Colin will have a set of questions that will come with other aspects. But in conclusion, I simply feel that given the geopolitical security environment and the global and interconnected as well as evolving challenges and threats, human security cannot be seen as something dispensable, a nice to have. I think it really needs investment and capabilities need to be developed. The words often used with human security or the individual human security areas of work are that they are, and there are various combinations of these words, a legal, moral, political, and strategic imperative. I actually think really these adjectives need to be understood in their full meaning as common values, credibility, legitimacy, and also mission success, I think, and human security are more closely linked to each other than ever before. Thank you.